I want to look a little bit at some of the skeptical things that Hume has to say about matters of fact. I mentioned that he is a skeptic as a philosopher, and by that I just mean that he pursues a method of doubting things. He tends to psychologically side with the way of thinking that requires proof before belief, rather than the opposites, rather than assuming corrigibly the correctness of somebody's opinion without finding out for yourself whether or not it is the case. Okay, but let's look on part 1 of section 4 on my page 15. I'm looking in the second. Actually, let me just read the first sentence of part 1. All the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into two kinds, to wit, relations of ideas and matters of fact. So there are two kinds of thinking. There are relations of ideas, and then there are matters of fact. Okay? Then he goes on to talk about relations of ideas. He says, relations of ideas are the sciences of geometry, algebra, and arithmetic. And in short, every affirmation which is either intuitively or demonstratively certain. Okay, for instance, that 3 times 5 is equal to the half of 30 expresses a relation between these numbers. Propositions of this kind, that is, relations of ideas, are discoverable by the mere operation of thought without dependence on what is anywhere existent in the universe. They can be ascertained without reference to another state of affairs. However, much more interesting for our purposes here and for the philosophical importance of them are matters of fact. Let me read the next sentence there in the next paragraph. Matters of fact, which are the second objects of human reason, are not ascertained in the same manner. Okay, the contrary of every matter of fact is still possible because it can never imply a contradiction and is conceived by the human mind with the same facility and distinctness as if ever so conformable to reality. That's a mouthful of 18th century writing. But basically what he's saying there is that matters of facts are proved to be true not by reference to the proposition itself, but by reference to that external state of affairs. Okay, and if you turn the page to page 16, several paragraphs down, Hume writes, all reasonings concerning matter of fact seem to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. By means of that relation alone, we can go beyond the evidence of our memory and senses. And so he's going to go on to talk about cause and effect and why cause and effect are important as a way of understanding matters of fact. Okay, and he's basically going to be arguing that whenever we have an experience of the world, that experience is making an impression upon our minds, and it's making an impression based on some assumptions that we have about cause and effect. Okay, and so for instance, he goes on to say that, this is on page 17 in the second paragraph down from what I just read. He says, I shall venture to affirm as a general proposition that the knowledge of this relation, that is the cause and effect relation, which governs matters of fact, is not in any instance attained by reasonings a priori, but arises entirely from experience, when we find that any particular objects are constantly conjoined with each other. Okay, that's a really famous sentence, and it's really quite controversial. But essentially what he's saying there is that whenever we form conclusions about the way the world is, and about the relation of cause and effect, and about one thing causing another in the world, we do so not on the basis of any necessity in the things themselves, but rather on the basis of experience. Okay, relations of ideas in Hume's work have a certain kind of structure. We'll say that they are true necessarily. Relations of ideas have the characteristic of being necessarily true. So we'll say this is the truth level that we'll call necessity. It's like a high truth level for a proposition. 8 and 8 is 16. Let me just use that as our working example for this lecture. 8 and 8 is 16 is a proposition which is true by necessity. It has to be true. Okay, but matters of fact exist at a lower truth level. Okay, matters of fact, these are relations of ideas. Here, matters of fact down here. Matters of fact exist at the truth level of contingency, not necessity. And by contingency, I mean they are only true by virtue of an inspection of the world, and moreover, Hume is going to argue their truth is actually a function of experience. Yeah, LeBron James is a tall human being is a matter of fact. That's a matter of fact. Okay, and let's just use that as our example sentence for matters of fact. Okay, LeBron is tall. Tallness is, of course, a relative characteristic. LeBron is tall relative to the rest of us, but if LeBron were suddenly on Mars among a race of giants, he might be very short. But to determine the truth of that proposition, LeBron is tall, you have to actually look at something external to the proposition itself and analyze the state of affairs outside of the proposition itself. Okay, now Hume is going to argue that causes and effects are discoverable not by reason but by experience. Come on in, Tiffany. They are discoverable by virtue of an inspection of the world and by experience. Okay, and this is like a really famous, and it was seen at the time as a really dangerous kind of a conclusion. Okay, let me talk about precisely what that means. And apologies for those of you guys who saw this illustration already last week. I'm going to go ahead and use it again as a way of getting this lecture going and our inspection of the different truth planes of necessity and contingency going. Okay, so back when I was in high school, we played pool and we played ping pong. This is before all the high schoolers had smartphones. Okay, and in the parlor game of pool, standard 8-ball, you have a cue ball, and we'll say the 8-ball is there, and the cue ball is struck by a cue stick at the, let's say it's the end of the game, right? And you try to hit the 8-ball in a particular way to knock it into a corner or side pocket and win the game. Okay, now, if I have the cue stick in hand, and I'm aiming it at the cue ball, and I ask you, as maybe you're an observer, if after I've hit this cue ball, the cue ball hits the 8-ball, what will happen to the 8-ball? And your answer should be? It'll move. Your answer should be it'll move. Okay, and this is a cause and effect relationship. The cue ball strikes the 8-ball, and the 8-ball moves. Okay, how do you know the 8-ball is going to move? Because of the laws of physics. How do you know the laws of physics are going to hold? Because of certain assumptions about the uniformity of nature. Okay, basically because of assumptions that you and I have made, I make them too, about the nature of the past being the same as the nature of the present, being the same as the nature of the future. Okay, certain assumptions about uniformity of nature underlie your assertion that the cue ball will cause the 8-ball to move after the cue ball strikes it. Okay, Hume would say that the assertion, the 8-ball will move when the cue ball strikes it, is a matter of fact, not a relation of ideas. Okay, so if I were to write down here, 8-ball will move when cue ball strikes it. And let's say that that's our proposition. Hume would say that that's a proposition of a kind that is a matter of fact. It has to be actually demonstrated to be true by an inspection of a state of affairs. It is not true necessarily. It's only true contingently. its truth is not contained within the proposition itself, like the truth of 8 and 8 is 16 is contained within the proposition itself. Okay, you have to actually inspect a state of affairs external to the proposition, namely a state of affairs where cue balls strike 8 balls and 8 balls move. Okay, but if you were, say, a mental virgin and had never before seen a cue ball strike an 8 ball, or for that matter, any object strike another object, would you know that the 8 ball would move when the cue ball strikes it? Hume would say no. You wouldn't know that. The only way you do know that is experience, by virtue of your experiences. Okay, experience is the basis for our belief that the cue ball is striking the 8 ball and in doing so causing the 8 ball to move. But experience is not the same as necessity. Experience is simply an accumulation of past instances where this has been the case, where this has happened. Okay, and as simply an accumulation of past instances, maybe you've seen 100 or 1,000 examples of one object striking another and the other one moving when the one strikes it. Okay, because of the extraordinary number of examples that you've seen, you conclude, Hume says, or your mind takes a leap, and that leap is false. Okay, that leap is a leap from the realm of contingency to the realm of necessity. Your mind comes to believe that there is some sort of necessary connection between the cue ball striking the 8 ball and the 8 ball moving. Okay, it is a false leap because you are now imposing upon the natural world certain expectations or assumptions which are not really present there. Okay, not really present in the world of experience, the realm of experience. You are imposing upon contingent propositions or contingent truths necessity, necessary truths. Okay, this is known more generally as the problem of induction. Okay, so I'm going to make that the third point of my lecture. And I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to take another pass in much greater detail today. The problem of induction is really central to science, and this is why Hume was seen as a dangerous thinker. The scientific method is devoted to the accumulation of observations and then the development of generalizations on the basis of those observations. Okay, you accumulate a series of observations about the world, and then you generalize from those observations and say, well, this has always been this way under every observed circumstance, so this must be this way. Okay, for instance, every observed instance of chalk being let go of has been an instance where it has fallen to the ground. So this must be the case. Okay, that's a scientific law called the law of gravity. Okay, but this is a problem, Hume says, because at the heart of the scientific method is a fallacy. The induction method that is so central to science takes particular instances, we'll say each one of these is an observational instance, and uses these particular instances to draw general conclusions. That's the general conclusion about each one of these particular instances. Okay, but in doing so, it actually makes a conceptual leap from the realm of contingency to a realm of necessity, which is not warranted. Okay, in other words, to put it a bit differently, generalizing about the properties of a class of objects based on some observations of particular instances of that class is actually fallacious. You can't generalize about a class of objects based on simply a number of observations about particular instances of that class. Okay, so use the age-old example, right? all observed zebras are striped. These are SZ for striped zebras. We haven't seen all the zebras in the world, but all the zebras that we've seen so far are striped. And so on that basis, we conclude, well, zebras must be striped animals. But to conclude from the set of all striped zebras to all zebras as such is to follow this problem of induction and to leap from the realm of contingency to the realm of necessity in a way that's unwarranted or unjustified. Okay, so what Hume is trying to make here is a point about the inability of science to justify itself. The scientific method is something that scientists believe to be accurate and reliable. But how do we know that it's accurate and reliable? Well, you cannot actually use the scientific method to prove that the scientific method is accurate and reliable. It's actually a fallacy. You cannot use contingent truths to attempt to prove the correctness of other contingent truths. And this lies at the heart of science and is deeply problematic. Let me just read a couple passages and then I'll throw it open to questions. A lot of people get confused about this, so I'm sure that I'm sowing confusion by talking about this today. But let me just read a couple passages so that you guys can see what Hume is trying to argue, to see it for yourselves from his own writing. And then I'll throw it open and we can talk about questions or comments. So I'm reading on my page 20. This is part 2, first paragraph. Okay, and I'm reading a couple sentences into part 2. This is still section 4, part 2. When it is asked, what is the nature of all our reasonings concerning matter of fact, the proper answer seems to be that they are founded on the relation of cause and effect. When again it is asked, what is the foundation of all our reasonings and conclusions concerning that relation, it may be replied in one word, experience. But if we still carry on our sifting humor and ask, what is the foundation of all conclusions from experience, this implies a new question. Okay, so basically there he's just saying what I said earlier, which is that matters of facts are true by virtue of experience. Okay, LeBron is tall as a matter of fact. We know that LeBron is tall by experience. You have to actually compare that proposition to some state of affairs that is outside of the proposition itself. And then this, the central feature of matters of fact is that they are founded on a relation of cause and effect. But to know whether the relation of cause and effect is correct is something that we have to actually do by virtue of experience. Okay, now if you turn the page and go to my page 22, this is about 3 paragraphs down. Okay, Hume writes, these two propositions are far from being the same. So here's the first proposition. I have found that such an object has always been attended with such an effect. Okay, such an object has always been attended with such an effect. That's the past assertion of that Hume is saying is one of the two propositions here. And then the second proposition, I foresee that other objects which are in appearance similar will be attended with similar effects. So taking observations about the past and assuming that that will be the case in the future, and in fact that is the case with all such things that are similar to the observations from the past, is fallacious. That's a fallacy. You can't do that, Hume says. Okay, so anyway, so that's what he says is the fallacious part. And on page 24, towards the end of section 4, he says it again very in a similar way. He says, when a man says, I have found in all past instances such sensible qualities conjoined with such secret powers, and when he says similar sensible qualities will always be conjoined with similar secret powers, he is not saying propositions that are the same. Okay, to say that something has always been the case in the past is not the same as saying that something is necessarily the case. Okay, the answer that you should give when I ask you, will the 8-ball move when the cue ball strikes it, should not be, well, yes, because the laws of physics hold always and everywhere. Rather, Hume is saying what your answer should be is it's always done so before. Okay, it's always moved whenever the cue ball has struck it before. So I have reason to believe that it will do so again based on past experience, but not based on some law of nature as such. Okay, now I've probably thoroughly confused everybody with this discussion. Let me stop and ask for questions or comments, or, just clarifying ideas or thoughts. Yeah, Zaire. Why is it a fallacy? Yeah, for sure. Because to say that the 8 ball has to move when the cue ball strikes it is to take a proposition that is a matter of fact, the 8 ball will move when the cue ball strikes it, and to assert that this proposition is necessarily true, when in fact the only things that are necessarily true are relations of ideas, and the 8 ball will move when the cue ball strikes it is not a relation of ideas, it is a matter of fact, so it is only contingently true. That is, it is only something that you know to have been true in the past every time the cue ball struck the 8 ball.
So that wouldn't necessarily be like
That's not a proof that it will do so this time, is what Hume is saying.
So how would that not be? Like what would be proof?
Sure, you can't give one, is what he's saying. He's saying that humans' minds are necessarily limited. You cannot get around the fact that we are temporally bounded and that we can't see all instances of any particular cue, all instances of all cue balls everywhere always striking 8 balls. Because we are limited, we only can rely upon what we have had experience of. And to say that every time a cue ball strikes an 8 ball, the 8 ball has to move is to leap from those experiences, which are just historical in nature, to assertions about necessity and things having to be the case. And that's the fallacious part. Yeah. Yeah, that would be the only proof, is if you hit it and actually it moved. That's the only proof that in fact it will do so. Yes, that's exactly right. And in fact, you cannot prove that in the future, every time a cue ball strikes an 8 ball, the 8 ball will move. All you can do is rely upon past instances of that and say, every time it's happened before, the 8 ball has moved. But you can't ever show that it necessarily will move when the cue ball strikes it. That's the fallacious part, is to say that it necessarily will move. Okay. Clarifying questions. Does everybody kind of get it? Kind of sort of? Tiffany? Yeah, so I don't know that this necessarily causes a problem. This particular idea causes a problem for Christian doctrine. It definitely causes a problem for scientific inquiry, for sure. So you could say, so I'm a theist, and I think that God made the world and made the universe and all the contingencies and physical uniformities around us. So as such, the way I solve this problem is I say something like, I believe that God guarantees the uniformity of nature. Which means that things that have happened a particular way in the past will resemble things in the present and in the future. There will be a uniformity there. So every time in the past when I've let go of the piece of chalk, the chalk has fallen to the ground. Hume says this shows that past instances of this phenomenon have resulted in chalk falling to the ground, but it does not show that future instances of it will also result in the chalk falling to the ground. It's simply a historical accumulation of experiences. So as a theist, I would say, well, God guarantees the uniformity of nature. So he guarantees that the past, present, and future resemble each other. And so God guarantees that in the future, when chalk is let go of, it will fall to the ground. So I guess it would cause problems for Christian doctrine if you subscribed to a view of Christian doctrine that required necessity in nature to be true as such. But not if you say that God guarantees the uniformity. There's a different track you can take, in other words. Not if you say that God guarantees the uniformity of natural experiences. Does that help a little bit? Maybe if the question were a little bit clearer about precisely what the conflict is, I could better understand what's at stake here. Sure. Okay. Yeah, I'd probably have to be like listening directly to it because it's not sparking in my mind some immediate thought, oh yes, this is a problem for Christian doctrine. It's a problem for science and for the scientific method, especially inductive reasoning. But it's not necessarily a problem for Christian doctrine as such. Maybe so. Could be. Hume was seen as really dangerous because he lived in a time of great scientific inquiry, and so he was calling into question the efficacy of science. And that was seen as really dangerous. Yeah. You guys all know, of course, that in logic there are different kinds of reasoning. So, for instance, there's deductive reasoning and then there's inductive reasoning. Yes? I've talked about this before in class. Okay, what is deductive reasoning? Deductive reasoning reasons from general things to particular things. Okay, deductive reasoning takes general kinds of claims and on that basis makes assertions about particular instances or particular cases. Okay, so let's take a case. So, I don't know why this just came to mind. This is really random. Okay, so Spock in Star Trek. Was he a Klingon? Really is? You guys remember? I think, okay, so whatever he is, maybe he's a Vulcan. I can't remember. He can't feel emotion. Okay? So, I think he's like a Vulcan. I think we'll just say he is. Okay? All Vulcans can't feel emotion. Spock is a Vulcan, therefore he can't feel emotion. That's an example of deductive reasoning. Reasoning from a general observation about a class of people to a particular instance for a particular person. That's deduction. Induction, by contrast, reasons in just the opposite way. Induction reasons from particulars to generals. Okay? So induction takes particular observations and on the basis of those particular observations makes general purpose claims about all such instances or all such observations. Okay, so for instance, here's an example of inductive reasoning. Basically, Hume is saying, by the way, that induction is a fallacious form of reasoning. That's what he's saying. Okay, here's an example of inductive reasoning. The sun always rises in the east. Okay, why do I say this? Well, I've been around for a while. And every day of my life, the sun has always risen in the east. It's never risen in the west. Or not risen at all. Every day it's always risen in the east. So I reason from this set of statistical observations, those are my particulars. I say, more generally, the sun always rises in the east. Okay, that's an example of induction. It's a generalization about particular observations. And in that sense, it's like a lot of scientific inquiry, which takes particular observations and then makes a generalization on that basis. But I could also say something like this and be reasoning just as legitimately as I was just doing about the sun. I could say, I've seen a lot of people die in the course of my life. Okay, and I've known people who have died and read about people who have died, watched people in movies die, right? I've seen a lot of people die in the course of my life. But it's never been me. So I must not be able to die. Okay? That's the same kind of reasoning. Taking a bunch of instances which have all been in a particular way. Okay, and on that basis, making a general conclusion, which is false. Okay, or how about this one? This is a really famous philosophical example, right? So the chicken gets fed by the farmer every day. Every morning, the farmer comes, feeds the chicken. The chicken thinks to himself, this has happened 500 times. Tomorrow morning when the farmer comes, he's going to feed me, gruel or whatever, right? But tomorrow morning arrives. Little does the chicken know, it is the day of reckoning. The farmer grabs the chicken and wrings its neck. The chicken reasoned fallaciously. The chicken proceeded inductively using the inductive method and reasoned that since all past instances of the farmer coming in the morning have been times when the farmer has brought food, the next instance must be like it. But it turns out the next instance isn't like it at all. Okay, because the chicken is a bad scientist. The chicken is using fallacious inductive reasoning. Okay. Okay. All right. Questions or comments about this? We're going to get to Hume's solution to this momentarily, but I want to see if anybody has any questions or comments here. Okay, when we come back from break in a minute, I'm going to offer a couple of different potential solutions to the problem of induction proposed by other people, not by Hume. And then I'm going to talk about Hume's own resolution to the problem of induction. Okay, what he will go on to argue in the course of the inquiry. But let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we will explore these topics further. I want to start the second half here by talking a little bit about some potential solutions to the problem of induction. Okay, one solution I'm going to call the bite the bullet solution. Okay, and this solution is just to say that a world without induction or inaccessible to inductive procedure would simply not be conceivable. Okay, so we just have to assume some principle of homogeneity. We just have to assume that the future and the past resemble each other. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to conceive of the way the world works. Okay, and I call this the bite the bullet solution because it doesn't really refute Hume's objections. It simply says, well, you have to make certain assumptions in order for the world to work. Okay, the second potential solution we might call a statistical defense of induction. Or a statistical solution. And the statistical solution is also straightforward. And this solution is just that you can base your confidence in a particular inductive observation on the number of instances of observation that you have in hand. And this is actually pretty close to Hume's own solution. Okay, so imagine that there's like this big barrel full of ping pong balls. And maybe there are 20,000 ping pong balls in the barrel. And we've drawn 19,000 ping pong balls from the barrel. Okay, and so far all of them are red. All 19,000 of the ping pong balls from the barrel are all red. And we conclude on this basis, well, the 1,000 that are left over must also all be red. Okay, well, that's not a perfect inductive conclusion. It's certainly a contingent truth. Still, it's got 19,000 instances to back it up. And so you can say with at least 19,000 times confidence that it's very likely that everything there is red, just based on the number of instances of observation that you can rely upon. Okay, Hume's own solution is actually closely connected to that. It's a probability-based solution. Okay, but Hume calls it custom or habit. So we'll use his language. Let me read his words for himself. Okay, open up the text and we'll look in section 5. Okay, Hume writes, this is going to be hard for you to find. This is probably about 6 or 7 paragraphs in to section 5. Hume writes, this principle is custom or habit. For wherever the repetition of any particular act or operation produces a propensity to renew the same act or operation without being impelled by any reasoning or process of the understanding, we always say that this propensity is the effect of custom. That's really complex 18th century verbiage, but basically Hume is there saying that the reason why you think that the next time the chalk is let go of it's going to fall is because of habit, okay, or because of custom. Because that's the way it's been for a whole bunch of times. In fact, he writes in the next paragraph, custom then, I'm quoting here, is the great guide of human life. It is that principle alone which renders our experience useful to us and makes us expect for the future a similar train of events with those which have appeared in the past. Without the influence of custom, we should be entirely ignorant of every matter of fact beyond what is immediately present to the memory and senses. We should never know how to adjust means to ends or to employ our natural powers in the production of any effect. Okay, so the reason why you can justifiably live your life normally for Hume is on the basis of habits. Okay, that's the only basis that you can assume that the future will be like the past. It's because of habits. Okay, so just because Hume thinks that there's no necessity in the realm of matters of fact doesn't mean that he's going to go out to Fondren Road and, step into the road and, I don't know, what do the people drive out there? Was it 55? That seems to be what they drive on Fondren Road. Okay, and think, as he sees the oncoming car coming at 55 miles an hour, this time it's not going to hit me. Okay? He's not going to say that because he thinks that habit has shown him in the past that every time the car has come at 55 miles an hour, it has not been impeded by an object. Like it has just continued plowing on through. Okay, so there's no reason to think this time around when the car comes barreling towards him at 55 miles an hour that anything different is going to happen. Because habit shows him that a particular thing is the case. Okay, and habit is also the basis for what Hume thinks is uniformity in nature. Okay, so uniformitarianism is really central to the natural sciences. It's the assumption that the same natural laws and processes that operate in our present-day scientific observations have always operated in the universe in the past, and always will operate in the universe in the future, and also operate in other parts of the universe, parts that are different than our own. Uniformitarianism is an important assumption that underlies the natural sciences. Okay, but of course, it's primarily the case in certain kinds of sciences, and in other kinds of sciences, it's perhaps only contingently the case, which makes it a difficult principle sometimes to work with. In physics, it seems always to hold, but in something softer than physics like geology or biology, it's much harder to say that the future resembles the past, or will resemble the past, or the present resembles the past, like uniformitarianism asserts that we need to do. Okay, so just to summarize some of these thoughts, for Hume then, inductive reasoning and the belief in causality, that is cause and effect reasoning, cannot be rationally justified. Okay, you cannot rationally justify induction as a form of reasoning. Instead, induction results from custom and mental habit. Okay, we never actually perceive that one event causes another. We only experience what Hume calls a constant conjunction of events. Okay, that's a key Humean concept. Constant conjunction. We never actually experience cause and effect directly. We only experience a constant conjunction of events. Event A, the cue ball strikes the 8-ball. Event B, the 8-ball moves. We've always experienced these two events as being in constant conjunction with each other. When the cue ball strikes the 8-ball, event A happens. Event B always follows. The 8-ball moves. Okay, and that's the only way to explain cause and effect, not necessity. Okay, this means that to draw any causal inferences from past experiences, we have to presuppose that the future will resemble the past on the basis of habit. But Hume does not think that we can presuppose that the future will resemble the past on the basis of prior experience. Okay. Now, this is a really important topic, but it's also kind of a dry topic that people sometimes have difficulty getting into. Okay, I want to make sure that we all understand this topic. It's like a meta-scientific topic that's key to like the background assumptions that underlie the sciences, and this is the part of philosophy, the 18th century, 1711 to 1776 are his dates, where a lot of deep thinking was being done about the sciences, so we're investigating that. But sometimes it can be kind of dry and hard for people to dig into. Are there comments or thoughts about this or reflections on it, questions about it? Nothing is true necessarily. Things are only true probabilistically. So Hume's not going to step in front of the car. He'll say to himself, well, it's highly probable that the car will strike me because I've seen cars strike things before or just come barreling towards things before, right? And I've seen it a lot of times, so it's highly probable. So I think that's what he would say about truth, is that it's just a matter of high probability things. Yeah, good question. Other questions or reflections? I have a question for you guys. This is a difficult one. So if we were to follow Hume's reasoning here and say, well, we should base our belief in the truth of things on observation and on the number of instances that we have observed of something being the case. If we were to follow that reasoning and say, well, I will proportion my belief in the truth of something on the number of instances that I have observed of it, then most of the time I think we would be acting in a way that is rational and makes sense and is a defensible course of action. But it breaks down when you encounter abnormalities. That way of thinking or approaching life breaks down when stuff happens that's not like the rest or not like the past. So for instance, how about this one? In my personal experience, everybody who I have witnessed dying, I've seen them die, or everyone who I have heard from others has died, has not come back to life. This has happened a number of times now in my life. So Jesus must not have come back to life from the dead. Right? Makes sense based on the way Hume thinks. It's a way of thinking that works really well unless and until it encounters abnormalities. But Hume is going to argue in part 10 of the inquiry that miracles must not occur. Miracles must not occur because the balance of probability is always strongly against them. A miracle, by definition, is a very non-normal event. It's like a big abnormality. And so Hume is going to say, the balance of probability is always against miracles. So whenever we encounter a miracle, or are told about a miracle, or read about a miracle, we ought always to believe that it didn't happen. Because the balance of observed instances is much more heavily on the side of the miraculous event not occurring than this one instance, or 2 or 3 miracles, whatever, on the side of it having occurred. So it's a way of thinking that works until maybe it doesn't. Okay, and Hume's going to argue on this basis that you should never believe something that only has 1 or 2 or 3 observed instances to back it up. It's almost always explainable in terms of something else that you are not aware of. You know, the miracle is almost always explainable in some other terms than what you think. Okay, did Jesus rise from the dead? This is the most famous miracle of all time. Well, Hume would say you shouldn't believe it, because the great majority of people who have died have not risen from the dead. So the odds are this is more likely some sort of story or hoax or fictional account than that it's actually correct. Tiffany, maybe that's what your professor was getting into this morning. I'm not sure. But that is a part of Hume that is a challenge or an objection to Christianity. Christianity is false if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Okay? This is like the most famous miracle of all time. And the truth of the entire Christian religion depends upon it. Depends upon the actual occurrence, the physical occurrence of this miracle. Okay, I happen to believe that this miracle occurred, even though there are many, many, many more instances of people having died and not rising again than there are of someone having died and risen from the dead. Okay, so I think that Hume's way of thinking, this probabilistic-based reasoning where we should proportion our belief in the truth of something to the number of observed instances that we have of that thing. I think it's a way of thinking that works until it doesn't. It works until it encounters an anomaly that hasn't happened before or that it can't explain. And then I think it fails as a way of approaching the world. Okay, questions or comments here at the end? Cool, cool? All right, let's go ahead and split. Thank you for your attention. Be on the lookout for an email from me about